Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Instruqt Creators Connect. I'm your host, Sean Carolan, and our guests today are Greg Larkin and Alex Williamson from automation company Puppet, which was recently acquired by Perforce Labs. Greg, Alex, it's great to have you with us today. Let's start with some introductions and get to know everyone's backstories a bit. I'll go first. I'm Sean Carolan, Instruqt Director of Sales Engineering. Used to be a sysadmin. Back in the day, I worked with Puppet and other automation tools to build many Linux and Unix servers. And I live in Austin, Texas.
Hey, everybody. My name is Greg Larkin. I work at Puppet. I'm a senior principal training solutions engineer. So I spend a lot of time working on virtual classrooms and content and providing a great learning experience for our customers so they can learn how to use Puppet. I started using Puppet myself when I was self-employed and managing a number of servers that were varying flavors of operating system and type, and fell into that trap of managing everything with a bunch of scripts that often broke. And so a friend of mine recommended Puppet. I loved the tool. I started using it. I went to their user conference that year, and then I eventually applied for a job and joined. I can't believe this, but today is literally my 8-year anniversary. It is. I just saw that pop up in my memories this morning. And so 8 years. And I sort of had a career as a software development generalist. But as I mentioned, I was managing these different operating systems for the service I ran. And I really do take a lot of pride in communicating to our users and trying to get them to understand Puppet and get a lot of satisfaction out of that. Outside of work, I love to run in the mountains around here. I'm based outside of Sacramento, so I love to go up to Lake Tahoe and run long distances in the mountains. So that's me.
Thanks, Greg. Alex?
Yeah, I'm Alex Williamson. I'm also on Greg's team as a training solutions engineer here at Puppet. Not nearly as tenured. I've only been here for a year. Prior to that, I was a DevOps engineer at a software ISV firm based out of Tampa, Florida. Automation and automation engineering has always been something that is a big part of my career and even just my personal sort of hobby set. Automating problems away is really, really satisfying to me. So ending up at Puppet was a fantastic part of the journey. I've been really, really happy here, and working on Greg's team has been super rewarding. And working with the Instruqt platform has actually been really, really awesome. We've built a lot of cool stuff, and we're excited to tell you about it today. I have far too many hobbies to list, from music to books, and but yeah, IT has also been a massive hobby, and love language to me for a long time. So
Great. Thank you, Alex. So guys, I'm a big fan and longtime user of Puppet. At my last sysadmin job, our very small team managed thousands of machines with Puppet. It was a tool we relied on very heavily to keep things running smoothly. But some of our users may not be as involved as us in DevOps and automation. Before we go further and learn more about Puppet, could you explain a little bit more about what infrastructure as code is, and maybe explain it from an LA person's point of view?
Do you want to take that, Alex?
Sure. So when we're talking about Puppet specifically and infrastructure as code in the Puppet ecosystem, we are talking about a pure automation solution to provision and create, whether it's machines or servers or config that needs to land on servers, deploy applications, really an entire solution to automate. Like we like to say, automate toil away. So no longer are SSHing into machines to patch them or configure applications or to boot up services. A way to do that from a code perspective, right? You write code that looks like any other code, and it operates with concepts like Git branching and automated testing to have a real developer-like experience to provisioning your entire infrastructure. You might also hear, like, I think a new popular term is platform engineering. So that's really something that we do at Puppet, and we have an array of products really aimed at solving all of those problems, both on-prem and in the cloud.
Great. It's a great explanation. I like to think of infrastructure as code as kind of like the DNA for your infrastructure. These are human and machine readable instructions that make sure everything gets built right and stays in the correct state. And I think you even are able to see if something's compliant, right, from a security point of view. As a former sysadmin, I seeing what happens when people build things by hand. You end up with all these unique, kind of bespoke, handcrafted servers, which are impossible to manage at scale.
I'll throw a little war story in there, and that
Okay.
relates back to before I got to Puppet, and many of us may identify with this, is you get to the point where you're afraid to reboot the machine. You don't know what you've applied by hand. You don't know if it's going to come up automatically. There could be all kinds of other custom configurations or things that you just kind of put in place but forgot about and never added to an init script or something like that. That's where I got to before I learned Puppet.
Greg, I understand that feeling. We once had a machine that was up so long, we feared the little battery that powered the clock on the motherboard,
Yep.
had just probably died a couple of years ago. Great. So tell us a little more about Puppet, the company, and its history. I think we have a couple of slides for this.
Yeah, for sure. So it was founded by Luke Knies. He's a well-known luminary, I would say, at this point in the industry. And he was really trying to solve these problems because he was working with some prior iterations of automation tooling at his job as a system administrator, and was just getting frustrated and having to do a lot of hand maintenance and other types of things. And out of that became Puppet. He open sourced it early on. I mean, he was very much in favor of the open source movement. Worked with that for many years, started building a community around Puppet, and then eventually founded the Puppet the company, and launched Puppet Enterprise, which to this day, we still have that open source core. So anybody can go and download Puppet for free. They can build a Puppet infrastructure using our open source tooling. But for larger companies, as he became more aware of them and they became more aware of Puppet, he discovered that there were some needs for, an enterprise level product with support and training and all these other things that companies expect and need. So he grew the company through that process. And yeah, as you can see here, I mean, we have, tens of millions of nodes, tens of thousands of users. If you join our Puppet community Slack, I think there's now over 10,000 users in our main channel in there. And it's just beautiful to see, really, for me too, the community of Puppet. I mean, that is really what drew me to this company, and it's still very, very strong today. And so we're looking forward. We mentioned the acquisition by Perforce, and we would love to expand into new markets with it. So we're excited for the future, and we're super excited at the same time to be bringing all this new training that we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the hour.
Exciting journey, Greg. How many employees were there when you first joined?
I think when I joined, I was probably around, I think somewhere between 150 to 200. So it wasn't like, 10-person startup even at that point, but it had that feel, And I think the culture has persisted in that way, even up to the current day. So that's really important to us. Our culture is super important. We're very open. And like I said, very community focused, and we just love interacting with our customers directly. I love going on Slack and, seeing even ex-Puppet people still interacting and, all of that. It's a really strong community.
Yeah, Puppet was doing DevOps before we even called it DevOps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you two are on the education training side of the company, correct?
Correct. Yeah, we're technically in the technical education department.
Yeah. So tell us about the old days. What was it like, when you first started to build content and workshops?
Yes. What would have been a really good visual aid is if I could, and it might still be around here, but when I was starting, my first position at Puppet was professional services engineer, which meant I spent half my time roughly teaching in person and half my time going to customers and implementing Puppet and helping them get ramped up. And one of the first things they gave me was a physical professional services engineer toolkit, which was a collection of hubs and cables and all kinds of presenting tools and things. And this will relate in a minute, but basically back then what we would do is we would go to a company or a micro center type training facility with our laptop, which had the Puppet software installed on it, the server software. And all of our students prior to the class were given instructions to download a roughly 2 gigabyte virtual machine, get virtualization set up, deploy the agent software, and get everything ready before class. And then we would get to class and we would have to network ourselves together. So this was incredibly painful. And you can guess how many people did the preparation prior. They've got jobs. They don't have time to be doing this. We'd get into class and sometimes we'd burn a half to 3/4 of the first day of a 3-day class with a ton of material, just trying to get our machines connected and talking to each other. Super frustrating. I remember at some company I went to, they brought in like a 48-port switch one day and they were wiring us all up in the cloud. I mean, it was just not a great experience for the instructor or the student. So that was kind of the very distant past. And that persisted maybe until about 2016 or so, 17. And then on the next slide, sort of where we started migrating. Oh, I'm sorry, did we miss the?
We missed one.
Okay, yeah, that one, good. Yep. So and then the next slide, please.
Okay.
So then, I guess that one's out of order. I'm sorry.
Oh, should I have done this one first?
Yeah, no, just go to the next slide, I guess.
Okay. Let's start here.
Okay, hold on. Let me just see what the sequence is here. I'm sorry. Okay, I think one of the slides may have.
Do I have an old copy of the deck?
No, let me just check and see.
Okay.
Okay, I think. Yeah, go forward a couple more slides. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We'll get to the. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so so in the more recent past, we did start migrating some of this to more of a virtual setup on AWS. And at the time, I think we were still doing in-person training, but they were then starting to use the virtual platform. And then eventually virtual training became more and more prevalent. And then eventually the pandemic. So we went to all virtual. And through that period of time, we started building, more and more custom tooling. We were experimenting with different ways of launching classrooms on AWS. We had a couple different iterations, and then we finally ended up with what we currently migrated off of onto Instruqt is this internally coded tool named Hydra. And Hydra was a collection of Terraform and Python and YAML and all manner of other types of formats and languages that eventually grew to about 17,000 lines of this scaffolding code. And this code was simply there to spin up the classroom. This is not, these lines counted here are not the amount of content we had or the actual lab instructions. This is just scaffolding that we were trying to get things set up. And I will say it's had a checkered past. I mean, we would constantly have maintenance issues, other types of problems popping up. Alex, do you have any favorite war stories about Hydra that you'd like to share? I know that you did a lot of integration work before we migrated. There we go.
For a visual reference for our listeners,
Hydra I actually used the same picture in a code repository project for fixing some of the problems. Right. And that picture, I think, is there.
A mythical beast with many, many heads.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it got hard to keep track of what it was doing, right? Because the code had outlived some of its original designers, and keeping it alive, like the slide says, was really, really expensive from a cognition standpoint, right? Just like understanding what the code did, and coming in as a new engineer and trying to take care of it. This is a story we hear all the time, right? Like code outlives its original designers, and someone comes in to take care of it. And that has cost, right? That has cognitive cost as well as monetary cost. And yeah, I mean, I think just when we started to look at it, right? Like, how do we fix this? How do we make this run a little bit better? Can we extend it to do some of these other labs we knew we wanted to eventually build, like for other products, bolt-on, snap-on products to Puppet Enterprise that had pretty, fancy additional feature sets that we wanted to demo, but how to do it in the original tool was sort of escaped us when we started to dive into the source code. So, and then Instruqt ended up being the answer there, right? It enabled us to do what we could not have done in an acceptable time frame with that old code.
Now, do you think there's some lack of visibility, or I've heard so many stories about homegrown environments, and maybe there's a mismatch between what the world sees from the outside, right? They're like, oh, that was a great course, Greg. Can you just whip out another one? And like that you just have this giant sack of material that is ready to go, right? But as you two both know, I mean, what do you think like is the ratio of development time to actual lab time, right? And building a great workshop? 40 hours, 60 hours, something like that?
Yeah, I think it could easily take one full dedicated week of 8-hour days to build something really compelling.
Right.
We're talking about products like this, right, where we're showing you a whole other set of technologies and concepts, and we're trying to teach that, and completely different to what's actually hosting it, right? Like we're trying to teach.
Exactly. That's a great point. You guys are experts at this, right? Like you eat, sleep, and breathe Puppet automation, and that's just the content creation. We're not even talking about the stuff that you had this whole homegrown solution just to get to the point where you can repeatably run content and hand it over to an instructor and say, all right, here you go, here's your lab.
Yeah, I mean the timeline, I can't even estimate how many people. I mean, there were many different developers over the lifetime of Hydra. It started several years ago. We're still, just about to completely move off of it. We're going to be doing that, within the next few months, I would say, by the third quarter. And once that's done, it's done, and we won't have to worry about it anymore. And, over its lifetime, I mean, a handful of developers, how many hours were spent just maintaining it and not adding value to our courseware development. That's really what our focus needs to be. We need to be working on content and training people, getting them excited about using Puppet. We don't need to be spending time maintaining this thing that, is very brittle and has a lot of issues.
And was there a particular tipping point? Was there a straw that broke the camel's back when you just sat down and said, we got to look for a tool to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a tipping point for me is I certainly don't want to be getting pager alerts at 2 a.m. when a classroom crashes in the UK, things like that.
Yeah.
That sort of red flag starts popping up and it starts getting escalated and such. And then I think also, we had management changes above us come in and do a really great evaluation of all of our systems and looking for ways to improve and streamline. And we were empowered to say, hey, like, this isn't working really well for us. We're spending a lot of time maintaining. And then we were given the green light to go out and start evaluating platforms. And I think we were all recognizing that it was time. The original, I think, as Alex mentioned, the original developers were no longer with us. We're sort of in there spelunking every day and not getting a lot of benefit from that. Let's just rethink this and just open our minds to using something else.
Excellent. It seems that everybody who's never done this before looks at it and says, well, come on, guys, how hard can it be? We have a cloud account. Why don't we just build our own thing? What are some of the risks or pitfalls of this perception?
For me, it's much more comforting to have a separate organization dedicated to maintaining that scaffolding, and then we build the value add on it. Like at the end of the day, for me, that's the benefit. I want somebody that I can call or email or Slack and say, hey, like, we're having this issue. Are you noticing it? And not just me, but a community of people. So as like, we're in Slack all the time and there's other users in there. And so maybe I ran into a problem. Well, so did somebody else. And then that might escalate things on your end and provide us a fix. And that might happen much more quickly than us running through our homegrown code, trying to figure it out on our own. So I like the the ability of being able to reach out, and talk to somebody, get in touch with somebody, and look at that, and know that it's being, handled. We really don't want to be, especially in our group, which is, reasonably small. We don't want to have just one person have the keys to the kingdom. So in our situation, I think it makes sense to offload that to a vendor.
Great. Were there any kind of unique things that jumped out at you? I remember my light bulb moments being an early Instruqt user, going, wow, you mean I don't have to do that anymore? Oh, yes. Yeah, please take it from me. I don't want that.
Anything you can speak to there, Alex?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, I was able to be productive almost immediately. So, being the least tenured person on the team, I was still able to show up and within days start contributing to building labs in Instruqt. Whereas, so we had this parallel thing going on, right? Where we had the old code set that we would, Greg is teaching me how to fix that code and how to keep it alive. And before I was confident enough to make a change there to fix something, I mean, it was months, right? Again, this is a common story where the ramp up time for a developer or an engineer to consume something that custom is it's cost that you're consuming, right? To get them productive. Whereas with Instruqt, I was out on your docs page and I think I was productive in a day, right? Like I knew how to make changes. I knew how to write a setup script like this. It all just clicks, right? Because I didn't have to worry about, well, where are these machines and are they secure? And how do people get to them? How do I get to them, right? I didn't have all of that just gone. All of that, I'm not worried about SSH keys or RDP connections or anything like that, right? Like the networking, it's a huge problem, right? Like Greg just said, back in the day when you're connecting routers together or you're trying to SSH machines in the cloud, you have to solve all these problems. You have to solve them constantly. Those things just not being hurdles, you're so much closer to the finish line, right? And like that was the real light bulb moment for me. It was almost immediate that I was starting so much closer to what I wanted to end up with, and there was just very little track to lay to get there.
Yeah, that's a liberating feeling when you're like, hey,
Absolutely.
let's give you a quick like shortcut up the mountain. You can start at the halfway point.
Yeah, I don't run or race, as is quite obvious, as compared to Greg. And so start me at the finish line. Like I'm fine with that. Like, just give me the Gatorade. That's what I want.
I like that. My moment was when I realized, you mean I get this whole cloud account to myself? Like there's no other users in here. It really felt weird, but it was very liberating too. And then I could build anything without worrying about running out of VPCs or, gateways or what have you.
Yeah.
And the cleanup too. Leave it running. It just goes away. It gets deleted. No one has to think about it.
I was just going to mention that as maybe a real good selling point for people listening to. We were chatting about this before the webinar started, and that whole just phantom type of infrastructure that's being left running that you don't even really know about and you've lost track of. It's kind of like, just sitting out there and you haven't cleaned it up. Maybe some kind of destroy process failed midway, and now you've got a bunch of instances and load balancers and DNS records just hanging out in AWS, consuming resources and consuming costs. And like we were talking about prior, the only way you may know about it is when the finance department sends you an invoice saying, wait a minute, why are we now spending $8,000 a month on this? That you hit that limit where they notice, and that's how you figure this stuff out. We don't have to worry about that anymore with Instruqt, and we really like that.
Great. So as we, continue the conversation, let's talk about Instruqt a little bit.
Yeah.
Some of our folks who just joined still might not be clear on, well, what is this Instruqt thing? Why is it spelled with a Q? Instruqt is a virtual labs platform that you access through your web browser. We are a company based in the Netherlands, but we have a small US office as well. Most of our users are in the US, including me. So I'm here to help and support our users along the way. And what can Instruqt do for you? Well, this is just a partial list. It really is a sandbox or a builder's environment. So as we say, if you can dream it, you can build it. If you need cloud accounts, containers, virtual machines, either lightweight, small Kubernetes, K3s, or full-blown Kubernetes. And even things like an IDE or a text editor, Windows desktops, pretty much anything you want to build, you can build with Instruqt. So that's just a little platform overview so that folks, can understand what it is Alex and Greg are using today to build content. So let's kind of zoom the clock forward now. What are we doing today, and how's Instruqt going for you?
Oh, well, it's going great. I mean, I can't say enough, really. And another interesting point too, and to Alex's point about, starting so much closer to the finish line, we had a unique situation where he and other people joined our team right at the same time that we were getting up to speed with Instruqt, myself included. So we were all starting at this similar point with Instruqt and kind of going on the journey together, which was really, really nice in a way, because we were all just kind of coming up with ideas and trying new things and all of that. We didn't really have any established, way of doing things. So we just figured it out, and we've done that over the past 9 months or so, and we'll see a timeline in a little bit. But yeah, we did some product evaluations. We had some kind of high level requirements that we wanted to have with the tools that we chose so that we would improve our students' experience. And we really needed a flexible sandbox. We needed the ability to have any number of machines that we would spin up. We've got, Puppet Enterprise server software, we've got Puppet agent software, we've got Git repository servers, we've got workstations. All these things sort of comprise a development environment for learning Puppet. And we wanted the ability to define these things any way we saw fit, with different machine types and different specifications and all of that. Instruqt allows you to do that. We looked at other vendors that did not have that flexibility, and that was a huge selling point for us with Instruqt. Also, just the fact that we're not installing anything. We're no longer downloading, 2 or 3 gigabyte VMs and trying to get people's laptops set up with virtualization. Just such a terrible thing to have to deal with,
I need to jump in here. Did you use Vagrant? Was Vagrant on the?
I think in the distant past, we were using either VMware Fusion or VirtualBox.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of corporate laptops were not very happy with those tools.
No.
So, there was always a scramble. Like, where can I find a laptop that doesn't get, doesn't lock down? So just the zero installation, huge win, huge drop in the barrier to getting students in and just working and being successful. Browser-based is amazing because now we don't also have to worry about, can somebody get through SSH? Maybe they've got a firewall that won't let them SSH to AWS. We've seen that happen in the classrooms before. So we don't have to worry about any of that. And, our experience with you and Instruqt has just been fantastic. I feel like we've really been on a journey over the past 9 months, and we've established a really tight partnership. And, we've just enjoyed talking to you and working with all the engineers and everybody. And we feel like the openness of both organizations has really allowed us to just propel forward so much more quickly. So again, we really want to focus our coding and our other types of development on content and the things that are going to add value to our customer experience. We don't want to, and we're no longer interested in building scaffolding. That's what you're experts at, and we fully hand that over to you, and we trust you to do it. So we really are able to spend the time that makes sense to get our classes up and running and usable. So yeah, more markdown text than script code. Like that's where we're at right now. We don't have to worry as much about all those Python scripts and everything else.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit? Maybe speak to the educational, technical trainers and designers who might not necessarily be expert coders.
Yeah,
how
absolutely.
Can they contribute, and how can they work with Instruqt?
Instruqt has been so empowering for us in the technical education group, as well as instructional designers, editors, anyone in our larger organization that is responsible for enablement and design work for our courses. Prior to this, we would have to go in and update various types of homegrown. Also, we had a homegrown slide presentation tool, and that works. But it wasn't as user-friendly as some of the things that we're doing now in the lab. Here, somebody can go in, they can either use your GUI interface on the website, or we have the command line interface if people want to work directly with the markdown files. But in the GUI interface, you've got a fully visual type of editor that you can go in, make changes. Markdown is, relatively easy to learn. I mean, it has a few different types of, syntax decorators and things for bolding and italics and code formatting and all of that. And after a little bit of practice, I think we're all pretty comfortable with that, going in and adding instructions in the UI. So it's really been nice because it's just opened up the possibilities to other people who are contributing, in our group. And as a whole, I would say that we're just saving easily a half of a full-time employee's worth of time not maintaining the homegrown solution anymore. And that's just been a huge win for us. We can focus on things. There we go. So that's just an example of what a markdown file looks like. And there's plenty of markdown editors out there that you can download and actually kind of visually create markdown and then have it convert to the format that would be ingested by Instruqt. So there's lots of different ways to author things, and we really like that. And we just love the fact that I no longer get pager alerts at 2 a.m, which is a huge improvement.
Oh, that's great to hear. Not being woken up at 2 a.m. That's awesome. So we've heard a lot about Instruqt and Puppet so far. I'm sure our attendees are eager to see, well, what is this thing? What does it look like? With that in mind, I'm going to hand over the screen share to Alex, who's got a brief demo for us. It's going to illustrate both the Instruqt platform, and what you'll see running inside of Instruqt is a sample track that Alex and Greg have built. Over to you, Alex.
What's that? I think, it's waiting to, might need to right click me in the attendees list and give me.
Oh, okay. I have to promote you. Let's do that. Crown you host.
There we go. Cool. All right. So this is the Instruqt interface. If you haven't seen it, like we said in the talk, it's browser based. So I'm in Chrome. I've got a single tab open to my Instruqt lab. It's already launched and running. When you go to launch a lab for the first time, you'll get a start button on the landing page. The landing page will contain a little bit of a description of the lab that you're doing. That's how we've written ours. And you click start and you'll get a little spin-up page. Our average lab time is about 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. And we have, what you're looking at here is a remote desktop session to a Windows machine that is set up as a development workstation. So this is not only an entire Puppet enterprise production cluster, Puppet enterprise server, several worker nodes that are designed to run the agent and run some sort of workload. We additionally have, not pictured here in a tab, but in the background in this cluster is a Git server storing source code. And this workstation is fully equipped with VS Code and a complete set of developer tools, because what we're teaching in this case is how to write Puppet code and promote it all the way through production. So we have a real environment that we have been able to spin up in 4 minutes and will get disposed automatically when we're done using it, right? So previously that, like Greg said, could have maybe taken someone an entire week to just figure out how to do all of that. And then we'll start thinking about, well, what are we actually going to show? And so this is an order of magnitude less of just getting it up off the ground. So here's our Windows workstation. Like I said, it's got VS Code. It is ready to write code. I can check code out of my Git server. Like I said, there is a Git server running here, even though we don't interact with it directly in the lab. I can clone some code from this little Git instance that's running in my cluster. So there I pulled the code down in my Windows workstation, and I'm off to the races, going to write some code. And you can see here we have some, follow along instructions. You can resize this, and for us, like I said, we're instructing on in this lab best ways to structure Puppet code and how to write some. So we have this super detailed markdown file that accompanies the lab in this sort of instruction panel that you can copy the code directly from, or if you want to try to go it alone, you can collapse these detailed instruction sets and just follow along with the instructor and try to do it yourself. So we try to appease both audiences there, some who want to challenge or some who would rather just be shown exactly what to do so they can see it working. So like I said, this is the Windows workstation, and like it has a full set of development tools pre-installed on it, things that you would normally have to go figure out how to do yourself. So we have another set of development tools, one called PDK, which is a Puppet language linter and syntax checker that's installed locally. You would have to go do all that stuff yourself and figure it out. And sometimes it's nice to just see it working, right? To understand the value of something before you started to implement it at home. So that's another thing we're trying to show here. We've got a fully working Puppet Enterprise console. So in this case, the tab takes us to the web interface of that Puppet Enterprise server, and it's all set up. You can see here, it's already connected to these other worker nodes, and the full Puppet ecosystem of main server to worker nodes, all the networking is already sorted out for you. So you can, again, you start really close to the finish line here of what we're actually trying to show you. And here's the main server's console interface or command line interface. We can ping the other machines. Like I said, we can ping that Git server, even though it's hidden from the interface because we don't interact with it in the lab. It's there and alive. And then, tabbed interfaces to the other terminals for the other worker nodes. And we can even run the Puppet agent on those and get some communication going between them and the main server. So we'll see here, this agent number 3 has dialed home. It's connected to the main server and completed a Puppet lifecycle. If we cruise over here, we can see that node, agent 3, will have an updated log of the run that just completed, applied in 6 seconds. So again, all that networking is just sorted out for the learner, right? They can not worry about it right now, to just see things working. And that's huge, right? And it's not breaking in the face-to-face example, or Greg, where like, oh yeah, that port doesn't work on that router that we brought into the lab. I forgot about that. Plug your laptop into this other one, right? All those problems are just gone. And we're just teaching really quickly.
It's amazing how you can just drop the user into what looks like a simulation of a real production environment, using Puppet to manage everything.
Yeah, it is a real environment too. And we encourage in the labs, and when we're using the labs interactively during teaching, we encourage people to explore, because it is real, right? These are real virtual machines. They're talking to each other. It has Puppet Enterprise configured. Write your own code. Do something cool in the lab, right? You don't have to just follow what we've shown you. You can go off script a little bit and use it as your own little personal sandbox and your own scientist workbench to, build your muscles, right? And learn something parallel to what we're doing in the lab. Or maybe you work ahead, and go ahead, feel free to vamp and figure out something else. And that's also really, really powerful. But again, after 45 minutes, those machines just go away, and I don't have to worry about them as the developer on the other side building them. So
I'm curious, this may be outside of your department, but do new employees ever use this content to get familiar with Puppet?
Absolutely. We beta new material internally constantly as a way to show it to current employees, but also new employees are constantly filling up those classes. And then even myself, when I started a year ago, I took all of the classes internally. And yeah, it's fantastic. And we get really good feedback from these labs, specifically from other stakeholders internally who are using them, like you said, to not only level up their skills being a new employee, but longtime employees are like, well, it would be easier for me to look at this thing in Instruqt than to spin up my own AWS environment, especially when we got into some really, really complicated labs that we've recently built. That's actually the fastest way to get a look at some of those features now in the entire company.
That's amazing. So you become sort of the de facto conduit to like, hey, I'd like to try a new thing. Oh yeah, we just baked it into the Instruqt track. Go ahead
Absolutely.
and spin one up and you can look at it now.
Yep.
That's a use case I hadn't even thought of. Very cool.
Yeah, we have a product addition to Puppet Enterprise that it would take a while. It takes a while to set up. It's a complicated product. It does a bunch of stuff, and the Instruqt labs that spin it up automatically are now the fastest way to like actually get to using it quickly, right? So you don't have to set it up yourself, because you need to have all these other things. It's meant to plug into source control, and it runs Docker, Dockerized jobs, things like that. The Instruqt lab comes with all that ready to rock, and you can just see it working.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you built this awesome Windows workstation? I mean, it's like a full-featured workstation with everything you need in a browser, which for those of us who had to try and do this 10 years ago is like nothing short of a miracle, right?
Yeah, so we really got this working with very little code, to be honest. We used some of the guidance in your docs on how to get just a basic Windows environment working with remote desktop, and that's pretty painless. It's probably 10 lines of setup code. And then we build a sort of preloaded VM image. We just fork it off of a cloud-based Windows Server 2019 image, and then we add onto that image, and we add all the stuff that we want. And that's a installation script that's probably less than 50 lines of code to add VS Code, to download the various developer productivity suites that we want installed, and a couple of VS Code extensions. We just move through those pretty functionally, installing them all, and we put that image on ice, and then that image comes to life in Instruqt whenever anyone uses this lab. And yeah, it's, as compared to the slide that said 17,000 lines of custom code to spin up environments in AWS, I think our total Instruqt solution across 40 plus labs, all of varying complexity, is probably less than 500 lines.
Wow, that's an amazing reduction in complexity. How long does this particular lab take?
This lab could take, in a classroom environment with multiple students, could probably take up to half an hour as we go through teaching the various pieces of code. And we have you make a couple of really human mistakes and check in bad code, and then we fix it, and then eventually roll it to the Puppet ecosystem using a Git-based workflow. So
in other words, in the course of a day-long workshop, there might be multiple of these labs.
Absolutely.
And how do you approach it from the point of view of I learned something in lab A, and I kind of need to start where A left off and continue on from point B?
Yeah, so we have some code repositories in the cloud that keep track of those story beats, essentially.
Okay.
So we kind of consider them story beats. As you said, you're moving through a day of training, and you start with like a lab 1.0, which is just a basic environment, just configured very nominally, and you haven't done anything yet. And then we do something in lab 1.0, and we sort of record that as a story beat, and then we deploy that story beat in lab 2.0. Again, it's just a simple git pull, and we apply that code. It's not super complicated.
So in other words, even if a student missed a lab, or they totally just went off the rails and broke everything, you have a pretty easy way to reset them for the next session, so they're not lost and falling behind.
Yeah, which was another huge upshot of not having this long-lived training environment where you've handed someone, again, maybe their first time out of the gate using Puppet. Everyone's going to make mistakes, right? We actually want you to make mistakes and fix them in media res, because you're learning that way. But spending it's a trade-off, right? You spend a bunch of time fixing a student's environment to get them back to where they can now do step 2. You've spent all that time. This just allows you to say, okay, come back to this lab later. Go ahead and start at lab 2 now, and you'll start where you need to, with everything pre-configured, as though lab 1.0 had been completed successfully. And that's a huge upshot to keeping these really compressed and dense training sets that we do over the course of a day moving, right? You don't want to stall unnecessarily on fixing a problem, or again, fixing a problem that has nothing to do with the lab, right? So fixing some networking problem or SSH perms not working correctly, or the key is expired or something like that. Like, I just want to show them the thing, and this allows you to just keep it moving. So
yeah. And do people ever do these alone without an instructor?
Absolutely. We offer these as part of the in our Puppet education training portal. We have these things called practice labs, and they are Instruqt labs, and they allow you to level up your skills offline. And that was another thing that was part of the search, right, Greg, is the ability to have asynchronous learning as well as use the same solution in the classroom. Like, that was the panacea. And again, this is where we ended up.
So in other words, the labs are designed that if you have an instructor, great. And if not, you can do all the slides and work on your own schedule.
Yeah, we really with the complete revamp of all of our courseware and our labs, we really were focusing on outcomes, giving people practice, learning usable skills that they can immediately take back and apply at their job. And that's really why we wanted to offer these things also as self-paced, is that even if they take the course, they may want to go back and refresh themselves on a certain lab or a certain concept, and they have that ability. If they don't take the course, they can also do the same thing. And we just wanted that to be open to them. And this is something that we would not have been able to do with our previous solution, because that solution was designed for, a 3-day course. It would spin up and it would shut down, and that would be it. That's the only time it's available. But obviously with Instruqt, we can just go over, click the link, launch the track, and it's there, and it can be there anytime, 24 hours a day. So we love that.
And you're never more than 5 or 6 minutes tops from a full environment that's ready to go and tested even, right? Like it's actually tested and working.
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk some more about outcomes. Alex, do you have the slides? I can grab it if you don't have them up.
Yeah, I'll give the screen back to you.
Okay, cool. I think I need host too, if you want to hand me the host baton.
Can do. There you go.
All right, I've got the power. I'd like to talk a little bit more about, outcomes. We all know the users love this platform and hands-on learning in a browser. What's not to like? It's super fun. But what happens to all the data we collect about our users, and how are you able to use this data to not only improve the experience and the content, but also to show value to your business leadership? After all, they probably want to know what they're paying for and what business outcomes you might expect from using a tool like Instruqt.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I'll mention too that I haven't yet is that we really did want this platform to also supply us lead information, and we did have another type of learning asset that was called the Learning VM, and VM implies virtual machine. So you might guess where this is going. Well, this is a 3 GB download that would come down off of our site. Again, somebody would have to download it, get virtualization running, get all of that set up and start going through it. And it had great content in it. It has great content. It takes you all through many different facets of Puppet and learning the language and the ecosystem. And it was an extremely valuable lead generation tool for us, so that we would have people register, they would download it, and then we would contact them at some point after they had sort of gone through it. We wanted to preserve that same type of lead generation going to the new platform with Instruqt. And so we knew that we were going to use it in the classroom. We knew that we were going to provide it for free on demand to self-paced users. And then we needed to figure out a way to get that information so we could sort of track, who's using it, how often, and all of that. And we were able to do that with the webhook functionality. And that's something that I think was added after we started using Instruqt. So initially we had some hooks in our setup scripts and other things. that worked fine. But as we certainly discovered, once we added, dozens of tracks, we wanted something that was a little more centralized. And you must have been in tune with us because you added the webhook functionality, and that worked really well for us. So in this situation, what happens is, just for anybody who's not familiar, but there are certain events that get generated on the Instruqt platform when people start a track, start a challenge, complete a challenge, a variety of different things. There's a whole series of these different events. And what we do is we capture a couple of different events for starting a challenge and ending a challenge. So start or complete. And what that does is it triggers a API endpoint or a webhook endpoint in a tool that we have at Puppet called Workato. And Workato is a workflow automation tool. It's a SaaS product, and you can kind of connect all different types of applications to it, Slack and Git, and makes HTTP calls to servers and all kinds of different things. It's a pretty interesting tool and really useful. And so we create this endpoint. We register it on the Instruqt site, and anytime these events are generated, this endpoint gets called, and this thing called a recipe gets kicked off. And the recipe is just a series of steps. And the steps start doing things like validating the request is not corrupted, checking certain parameters to make sure everything's good. And then it moves through a process of collecting user information from the Instruqt API using GraphQL. We pull in the actual user's name, their email address, what track they're starting, what challenge they're working on, and we create this lead object. And the lead object is then passed over from the recipe to our Marketo marketing automation tool. And that records the information in that system. And we can then design marketing campaigns based on user behavior as we collect that data. So if somebody, say, was in a self-paced mode and they went to our education site and they started maybe the first 5 tracks, but then they kind of went away for a month, we might send them a trigger email and say, hey, we noticed you were doing these certain things. How about trying these additional tracks? Let us know what you think. You can do things like that with Marketo. And then Marketo also synchronizes over to Salesforce, so we can then correlate that same activity in the practice labs, in the classrooms with sales funnel activity. And that's hugely helpful so that we can then say to people above us, this is how our training, this is how our self-paced, our instructor-led, all of that is influencing people's sales decisions, whether they decide to purchase, whether they decide to expand their node count. All of that sort of falls into all of that sales analysis. So we can prove that people taking training, doing self-paced training are more successful with Puppet and tend to retain Puppet and renew Puppet and expand it in their organization.
You may even be reaching that elusive audience of people who don't like salespeople, developers and technical folks. They don't always want to talk to salespeople, right?
Yeah. I mean, we've opened the door. You can just go in. We've got at this point, I think, roughly 18 to 20, if I'm not mistaken, Alex. Tracks that are available for free right now. Like, they're literally on our education site right now. You can go in and launch these, any of them, and they're sort of set up sequentially, and they map the same sequence that you would see in our instructor-led training. But maybe you go there and you try them out. You're just learning Puppet. You say, okay, this is really interesting. Maybe I also need a little bit of help though in some certain areas, and that brings you to sign up for an instructor-led class. So there's multiple ways that this sort of lowers the barrier for people to try things and not feel, like you said, like I'm just going to get tons of sales calls out of the blue and have somebody trying to convince me to do something. I want to do it on my time, and we want them to have that feeling and have that ability.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add there too is, as part of just the education team, like, let's just talk about looking at the data here. It kind of lets us as cooks tune the recipe in real time. Right. So if someone abandons a track multiple times, we can keep track of that. And that lets us zoom in on, we need to do something here, right? We need to make this track's barrier to entry lower because it's getting lots of bailouts, right? And that again, lets us sort of get real-time stats on the patient as we continue to improve it. Another thing we wanted to do was a tool that let us constantly improve quickly. right? So that we could treat this, sort of as an agile software project and work in small focused sprints, but constantly improving the story. The content is constantly getting better. The labs are constantly getting better, and just getting that data back to our team is hugely valuable for making those content level improvements.
Yeah, I can attest to the passionate commitment Puppet education team has to making sure the user has a good experience. So definitely go take those free Puppet Instruqt tracks for a spin and try them out, because they're really well done. Tell us a little bit about Puppet Enterprise 501, which was that the course you showed us? Was that the track you just showed us?
So that was a track in 301.
Okay, so 501 is even more advanced and complex. Take us on a little tour. Tell us what's in it.
Sure. So yeah, course 501, the entire day is focused on hitting the ground running and getting a working continuous delivery for Puppet Enterprise installation setup. And that's that adjunct product I was talking about that adds lots of functionality to your Puppet Enterprise ecosystem, but it requires some setup. It is meant to plug into lots of things. And so to see it really working, those things have to exist. You have to have a GitLab instance, you have to have some hardware running Docker, and you have to have some Docker images pre-deployed, et cetera, right? It's a pretty complicated environment. And it itself is a Kubernetes-based deployment meant to run on a singleton Kubernetes node. So a little bit different than like a standard Kubernetes cluster where you might have the control plane running somewhere and the worker nodes running somewhere else. This is actually meant to run fully standalone on a singleton node. So it took some work to figure out what type of machine to run that on correctly inside Instruqt, and to get the networking figured out, because those Kubernetes containers that we were creating inside of your Kubernetes cluster, we had to network them correctly. We had to understand how the node ports were going to map from place to place inside the cluster that we ended up with. And the product itself takes a minute to deploy. It takes up to 30 minutes to install, especially if you don't have Kubernetes already deployed.
Yeah, amazing how you've reduced all that complexity into such a quick startup time. Folks who haven't done this by hand might have a hard time appreciating the amount of work that goes into building an entire, copy basically of an on-prem environment, which is what this looks like to me. Is that if I had my data center and VMware and stuff, and I need something to practice on, this would definitely fit the bill, right? It looks close enough to what I've worked with.
Yeah, for the students, and again, this was something that we betaed internally, and it had been being asked for a long time, to show people using CD for PE, because we want people to understand what it's doing, right? And not worry so much about having to set it up and do I have a GitLab instance and all these tokens set up in the right place. Like, let's get to showing them all this cool stuff that it can do quickly. And the internal reaction to being able to see that quickly was massive. That's what I was talking about earlier, where this is now the fastest way to see it working that exists in the company, I believe. And we've been asked by other internal stakeholders, like, hey, can I get access to that? I want to be able to look at these screens, and I don't want to take 2 hours to set it up myself. So it's been a tremendous value. And Kubernetes doesn't like to be rebooted. And but we build an image and we reboot it in Instruqt and we do it successfully. And that was pretty fascinating to get that actually working.
Yeah, I mean, you almost get testing as a side benefit, right? Because your platform, you're spinning up all these components over and over again and making sure they work. All right, so our final slide. This is kind of a timeline of your journey with Instruqt. When did you start to see real value from using the platform? I know you've been with us at least a year, right? About a year and a half. How long did it take to ramp up?
We're looking now, like our first initial launch, just a year ago. And, when we started, we started slow. And this There's a little bit of a parallel here too with people who use Puppet. We always stress this, like start small and expand, and that's what we did. And we have that mindset, I think, coming from this world. We did the same thing with Instruqt. So we got out there and we looked at some opportunities for how could we build a couple of tracks, intro tracks, things like that are relatively simple, relatively easy for people to understand. And we have another tool called Bolt, which is sort of a standalone orchestration tool. And we wanted to use that as our sort of first application to demonstrate with Instruqt. It has a very low threshold for installation. So you pretty much just run a yum install if you're on a Linux machine and you have this standalone application. So there's no Kubernetes cluster, there's no Puppet Enterprise software or anything like that. It's very simple. And we decided that was the right place to start. We didn't have to use any custom images. Everything was kind of out of the box. And we built a couple of tracks to teach people very basic usage of Bolt. Started working on that, proved the concepts, worked for us. We love the browser-based interface, like I've mentioned. And then we, at the same time, we're reevaluating how we were going to build out all of these different labs for our upcoming rewrite of all of our courses. And as we did that, we had to make certain decisions, like, do we want to have a single track for each day of classes with lots of challenges? Do we want to have individual tracks with single challenges? We chose the latter so that we could have a large offering of tracks in our education site. So we had to kind of like go through a lot of those processes and sort of set the the parameters around development. But then we just dove in, and we just started with our day one, which was pretty much concerned with like getting Puppet Enterprise up and running, installed. We wanted the students to actually do the installation. That's something they do in the first day in that PE 101 class. So they use Instruqt, they have a tarball, and they have to install the server and get the console up and running and see it. So the interesting thing there is that we have a tab, and Alex showed you that with the console. In our 101 class, if you go to the console tab right out of the gate, it's empty, and it has a little, I don't know what the little icon is, but there's nothing there because the software is not installed yet. So they have to walk through that, and that's your acceptance test. Did the console come up?
Right. So not only can you show it fully running, but if you need to teach someone how to install it from scratch, they can also walk through that.
Absolutely.
Guys, we're right at the hour. I want to make sure. Do you have a meeting after this?
No, I'm free.
Mind if we? Okay, so we could spill over for a couple minutes. I just got a couple more questions, and then we'll open up for the audience. Glowing feedback so far. What were a couple of the challenges you faced along the way?
Do you want to speak to some of those, Alex?
I think that one of the initial challenges we had was to size the machines correctly, right? Like figuring out the correct, CPU and RAM allocations to give that, like you said, the perfect customer user experience that we're after. Just figuring out what those needed to be, like what was the right mix of really robust machines. Maybe you needed to tweak the Windows machine a little bit to get it to be really snappy and responsive for that developer workstation. You don't want someone who's writing code feeling like they're writing code on a toaster. So, you just have to go through some of that. And that was trial and error mostly. And we got better at it over time. And some of the other initial challenges were, I think we were probably one of the first customers who was actively heavily using Windows. And, so that story kind of grew up along with us. But recently, you introduced Windows script support. And again, we were probably one of the first customers consuming that ability. And we were often writing Windows startup scripts really, really quickly. Yeah, and that probably just allowed us to enhance our offering.
Instruqt thanks you for the extra beta testing on the Windows platform. I mean, Puppet really did just grab a machete and just hack a path through the jungle. And now it's much more stable and easy to use. As you can see, you can have a familiar Windows desktop running right in your browser, in just a couple of clicks. Last one, any small piece of advice for new content creators who might be just starting this journey?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of community Slack channels, and, absolutely get in the channel. There's obviously people like Sean, there's people like myself and Alex that have been using the platform. I try to keep an eye in there, and if I see a question that I can answer, I'll try to answer it. And that's what I love about the Puppet Slack community as well. You know, we're all helping each other, trying to give that information. I know I've taken a lot of threads and posted them to people in my team that, oh, look at this, like somebody just figured this out, you know. So that is a really great way to kind of just get familiar and then start working on things. Start small, just take something like we did with a very simple installation, if it's that type of a track, and you know, try to just sort of like cobble it together on your own, maybe do some commands on your own workstation, and then start moving things up into the Instruqt environment. But the GUI is really, I think, a really great way for people to start out. You know, it's super easy once you sort of figure out like, okay, I need to build a sandbox with a couple of machines, and now I'm going to add some tabs, and that's what people are going to see. And then you launch it, and then you start adding some instructions, and then start, you know, at some point maybe add a check script. You know, we've sort of bit off each little feature like one by one. And then at this point, I would say like we're probably taking advantage of almost everything that the platform has to offer: tagging, GraphQL API, the webhook interface, setup scripts, check scripts, you know, all these things. So it's just been really a great learning journey for us. And as you can see, the timeline is not very long, and I feel like we're pretty far along with what we can do at this point. Really far along.
Excellent. Alex, any small pointers for a newbie?
I think I agree with Greg. Just jump in. It's really easy to use just the web UI, ignore all the other stuff. Use the web UI to just get a basic track started, add a virtual machine to it, and see how easy that is to get a real virtual machine that you can do whatever you want to in 30 seconds. And from there, just keep adding, right? And it's, you can really take it a small step at a time and build these things over time with very little effort.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm